boils down to, all of this, to me, boils down to how we want to treat our neighbors. But with that, let me introduce one of our neighbors from Lopez. Ed Kilduff has spent hours and hours and hours combing over the databases that the county has in its GIS system. I'll let Ed talk about that. And putting together the math and the renderings necessary to show you some maps that I think will be very eye-opening. So let's do-si-do here and hand this off to Ed.
That's right, I'm a foreigner, I'm from Lopez. I've lived in the San Juans about as long as Tim. Actually, Tim and I are very similar. We're the same age. We've been here about the same amount of time. If Tim were a geologist, he'd be me. If I were a lawyer, I'd be Tim. I'm a geologist and hydrogeologist. I've spent 20-something years cleaning up federal sites for the most part, groundwater and contaminated sites for the Department of Energy and for the Navy. That's who I am. Let me just take a second to change this around. And also, could we turn down the lights just a smidge so that people can be sure to see the maps a little bit better? I will do. Thank you. Appreciate it. Okay. That's us, the Common Sense Alliance, and we're an alliance because we're not actually a membership organization. We're just a collection of people who care about these things, the community, the economy, and the environment here in the islands. What I'm going to do is I'm going to show you maps. And what I did is I analyzed how many parcels are going to be affected by these ordinances. And that irritates the crap out of some people. In other words, looking at it from a parcel point of view, I know in particular it irritates Patty. She feels it's the wrong way to look at it, but that's not right. Parcels are exactly the way to look at this, because whether your parcel is affected a little bit or a lot, you're going to have to go through the same critical area review process. And you may have to go through it several times because you may be affected by more than one critical area. So the county in this is not designating critical areas. They are designating parcels for critical area review, and that's very important. Nobody knows what the outcome of that will be for any given parcel. So that's what this is basically summarizing. And I also want to say that the analysis that you're about to see in terms of how many parcels are affected does not include buffers in any way. So in that sense, it's conservative. It's a minimizing effect, what I'm going to show you, versus what the county's actually going to do. So, this is the county. Can everybody see this? This is the county, and this is the number of parcels. Right? There are about 17,000 parcels in the county, legal parcels, that is. There are more tax parcels, but we're going to look at this in terms of legal parcels. Alrighty, first of all, we're going to look at the parcels that are affected by shoreline habitat. And, you know, for people who don't know, those are the shorelines right there. And these are the shoreline parcels, the pink areas. Okay. Now, people may say, well, why do you have pink areas on the inside? Why is that the case? That's because shorelines don't include just marine shorelines. They include lakes. Okay. In particular, Tim talked about the CAOs, but the Shoreline Management Plan. The Shoreline Management Plan specifically captures lakes that are 20 acres and over. So those are going to have dual regulation for both the Shoreline Management Plan and for the CAOs. Now if I take away the lakes and just leave the parcels that are affected, that's what the next map is. And you can see that up here I've got how many parcels are affected. So shoreline parcels accounts for about 4,900, close to 5,000 parcels out of the 17,000. And those parcels cover about 38,000 acres, or about 34% of the acreage of the county. So those are the parcels affected by the shorelines, and we're going to go to geohazard. We're going to go to geohazards next. Okay. Can you hear me? Okay, it's working good. Okay, we're going to go to geohazards next. Now, primarily for geohazards, the county has looked at cliffs. All sorts of cliffs. Cliffs that have, I think it's more than a 40% slope or something. And these brown areas that are on this map identify all the areas that the county has picked as cliffs. It's a little difficult because there are a lot of cliffs along the shoreline. So let me take the shoreline away for a second. So you can see where the shoreline cliffs are. And you can see that there are a lot of shoreline cliffs because you can still kind of make out the outline of the islands. So these shoreline cliffs are for many of these areas what are called the feeder bluffs. I don't know if people have heard the term feeder bluffs. Have people heard the term feeder bluffs? Anybody? Okay. It's actually a fairly big deal because the county is claiming that these feeder bluffs need to be protected. In other words, you can't have any armoring on those. You can't have any. You basically have to let them erode because they say that those are the things that supply our beaches with sediment. I don't believe that. I believe that's completely wrong. But nevertheless, these shoreline hazardous areas, these geohazardous areas, correspond in many ways with this feeder bluff concept that's going around. So I'll put the shorelines back, and I'll color pink the areas that are affected by these cliffs. So these are the geohazard areas. Okay. And if I take away the actual feature and just leave the parcels, then the geohazard parcels affect 14% of the total number of parcels and about 35% of the area of the county. That's the area of the affected parcels. Still with me?
No.
Okay. No? Any questions?
What is a geohazard?
A geohazard basically is a geological hazard, and they consider cliffs to be geological hazards. There are other things that could be geological hazards, such as faults and liquefaction and other sorts of things. But for the most part, they have really just focused on cliffs that might erode or cause avalanches and things like that as a geologic hazard.
What do they consider a cliff? What's the height or whatever?
Yeah, it's not so much the height, it's the steepness of the slope. Exactly. And they have various ways of classifying that. Okay, so we've done shorelines and we've done cliffs, geohazards. Now we'll go on to wetlands. Before I show you the maps about wetlands, I want to give you some facts about the way the county has looked at wetlands, or the analysis that's been done. So, recently the county has hired a scientist to put together what's called the best available science synthesis. His name was Paul Adamus. And Paul Adamus came up with some findings. And they contrast with a wetland survey that was done by the county back in the 90s. That information was taken and put into the county's GIS system, but the real data, the actual survey itself, lives in a beat-up old red book in CDPD, in Community Development Planning. And I think I'm the only person who's looked at this in the last 10 years. So I've gone back to this, and I tried to compare that with what Adamus did. So Adamus identified 2,600 wetlands. He says there were 950 wetlands in the old survey, but there's actually 1,100 wetlands. He increased the area by 30% over what this 90s survey did. Now the really interesting thing is that Adamus went through and he rated every suspected wetland. And I must emphasize that it's a suspected wetland because through his sort of desk survey of wetlands, that's not a proper delineation of wetlands. You have to get somebody to come out on your property and do an evaluation. So his kind of desk survey of the county identified these things. And he rated the wetlands in the county out of 10. So from a 1 to 10 scale, with 10 being the best. He actually rated some wetlands 11, were that good. But his mean was 7.5, and the median was 8 for the suspected wetlands in the county. I mean, so we're essentially, we're being told we're going through this because of the impacts of development and things are bad, but he rated our wetlands extremely high in median for people who don't remember maybe their high school math. But that's 50% are above that rating and 50% are below. So 50% of our wetlands were rated 8 or better.
What does that mean? Would Cascade Lake be a 10 or a 1?
I think it was 11. Yeah, I think they rated Cascade Lake an 11.
So the more water, the higher the rating.
Well, he rated it, this specific way that Adamus rated was disturbance. So a highly disturbed wetland, he would rate as a 1. And a pristine wetland, he would rate as a 10. He should rate it as 10. Now, the really interesting thing is that he probably didn't know this because he probably didn't break it down. But he also noted which wetlands were on developed parcels and which wetlands were on undeveloped parcels. And he probably doesn't know this, but he rated the ones on developed parcels higher. And that's statistically significant, so you can run a statistical test on that, and that's just not a fluke. He consistently rated wetlands on developed parcels higher. So buffers, let me just have a word about buffer. You know, most of the wetlands in the county, according to Adamus, these suspected wetlands are fairly small. They're 0.4 acres. I mean, fairly small. It's still half an acre. I mean, that's a lot. It's, you know, about 20,000 square feet. But, you know, because if you figure that wetlands are roughly round, and you're going to put a buffer around that, again, if people remember their high school geometry, the R-squared rule, it doesn't take much of a buffer before you're protecting more buffer than you are wetland. And so, if you take the median size of a wetland, 0.4 acres, you only need a 31-foot buffer for the buffer to be the same size. Anything bigger than that, you're protecting more buffer than you are critical area. So, 30-foot buffers and above, and we're actually protecting more buffer than we are critical area. So, with that sort of prelude into wetlands, these are the wetlands that he identified in the county. Now, at this scale, because the median size is 0.4, it's kind of hard to see, but there's lots of wetlands. Like I said, there's nearly 2,800 wetlands. And if you show the parcels that are affected by wetlands, there they are. Many parcels are affected by more than wetland. I think over 900 parcels are affected by more than one wetland. So if I take the wetlands away and you just see the parcels that are affected are 22% of the parcels of the county, affecting 58%. Those constitute 58% of the area of the county. And if you love wetlands, or let me put it this way, if you like wetlands, you will love streams. This is streams. It looks like a bad case of varicose veins. It's just ugly. It's bad. So if you take that, and no buffers around this, if you take that and you identify the number of parcels that are affected, there we go. And if I take the streams away, so I just leave the parcels, there we go. It affects 6,000 parcels, which is 38% of the parcels in the county, and that's 75% of those parcels make up 75% of the area. So just to recap, and then I'm going to go into a little bit of a blurb about functions and values, but just to recap the map portion of my talk, we have shorelines, including lakes, and we had geohazards, or cliffs, and then we had wetlands, and then we had streams, and we say, okay, what are the parcels that have those things on them and are affected by this? There you go. And then I take the actual feature away and I just leave the parcels, and there we have it. So 8,600 parcels, half the county in terms of number of parcels. There are a lot of parcels in this county that are small, by the way, and that's why you don't get more than 50%. The median size of the parcels in the county is 1.7 acres. So the area affected, or these parcels constitute an area that's about 87,000 acres, or about 78% of the county. So, not all parts. Yes, sir, question?
What constitutes a stream? Is that a full-time, year-round flowing? Or
No,
is there any definition?
Yeah, I could talk to you for an hour about that. I mean, really, there is no legal definition of a stream. You really need a hydrogeologist or a geomorphologist to come like that. That's the real answer. But the county, the Adamus, the scientist that he brought in, he counted drainage ways. This drainage ways. And I think it was Frederick asking, can you explain drainage ways? What is drainage way? Adam said, oh, it's a scientific term. My duty is a scientific term, but it flew. And that's how he mapped these things. He mapped every line, every lineament, every little thing out there as a stream. Anyway, Friday Harbor doesn't have to comply with the critical areas, or at least not the county's critical areas ordinance, because they're a separately incorporated area and they have to do their own. But they're not part of this. And so if you exclude Friday Harbor, let me go back. You see, there's a lot of weight there. That's where Friday Harbor is. So Friday Harbor, for the most part, doesn't have a lot of these critical areas in the first place. So if you exclude them from consideration, and also if you exclude all the other protected lands in the county, we have a lot of protected land in the county. So I went through and I tried to identify everything that was already managed as a natural or conservation area, whether it be public land or private land. And I tried to identify all public land, and then I tried to identify all those areas that had conservation easements on it, and that's what all these blue areas are, plus Friday Harbor. I haven't seen anyway, a map including all protected lands in the county, so this is my first shot at it. So if you look at the unaffected parcels that are outside these areas, whoops, that's what you're left with. So if you look at the parcels that are outside of conservation areas that remain unaffected, it's about 9% of the area of the county, about 31% in terms of number of parcels. So that's my analysis of the effect on the average citizen here. You will be affected. Your parcel will be affected. And how it will be affected, a lot of these good questions, it's really kind of uncertain how the outcome of your critical area review might be, and it will affect not just your structures, but as Tim was saying, possibly the things that you do on your property too. Now, one of the problems with what the county has done is I felt that they have not appropriately looked at functions and values. That is what critical areas are supposed to do. They're for our welfare. They're supposed to protect us from hazards, and they're supposed to protect the functions and values of these critical areas for our benefit. This comes from an EPA briefing, but this is kind of a well-known way of looking at functions and values, and you're supposed to look at not what it is, or how much acreage it is, but what it does. So in the case of wetlands, you're supposed to look at the hydrologic functions, the habitat functions, the water quality functions. Those are the way it functions. And the values are the things, the pleasure, the human well-being we derive from it. Things like we go recreation or sport fishing or duck hunting or whatever. And there's been no discussion in this county about what the values are that we derive from these things. Look. There are functional systems out there, but the county has not done a functional analysis. Many eastern states have pretty well-developed systems for functional evaluation of wetlands. Connecticut, New Hampshire seems to be particularly good. There's even a federal highway method. The amazing thing is that the county brought in this fellow named Adams. He developed the highway method, but he didn't tell the county that. So it's just another slide to show that these functional systems are in use in many different places. So it's not as if we have to reinvent the wheel. We can use these systems to try to evaluate the functions and values are here. And there's been kind of an evolution of the way we look at functions and values. Begin back in 1972. Right now, a common term for looking at functions and values is something called ecosystem services, and it's kind of a nice way to look at things because it's really based on what benefits people obtain from critical areas. So these are ecosystem services, and this is some sort of complicated chart, but basically the point is that these ecosystem services promote well-being, human well-being. And that concept has been completely lost in the analysis that has been done by the county. And ecologists like to talk about, and this is a very key point, ecologists like to talk about process, structure, functions, and values. And there is a sequence there. So geologic processes or processes like chemical processes and geologic processes, those sorts of things create structures like cliffs, like forests, like streams. And those structures have functions. They function a certain way, and we derive value from those functions. The county, I think, has totally missed the point because they have protected structures. They haven't looked at functions and values. And this is on the right-hand side. This is just some crazy, wacky idea. Everybody's going to this functional approach. This is the Corps of Engineers hydrogeomorphic approach, where they have sort of grouped functions around wetlands and where they are in the watershed, whether they be marine wetlands or river wetlands or things like that. And the Corps of Engineers basically has said there can be no meaningful assessment or meaningful mitigation without a functional assessment. So they've gone away from trying to replace acreage. So if you damage a wetland, it's not necessarily you have to replace that amount of acreage. You have to replace the function associated with that. So functions and values, these are the things you should ask your council people. Not how big is it, or what it is, or where it is, but what does it do for us? And these are public safety protected and what kinds of things do we derive from it in terms of value. So, you know, when you're in, I think the county has missed it again. And I put these up here because these are just examples of people who have missed it. They've blown it, right? Headlines about it. And when you're in the echo chamber, you don't necessarily realize you're missing it. And the county has missed it again. And they put some of those up there. I love this one. I love it. Statistics show that teen pregnancy drops off significantly after age 25. These are actual headlines. These are actual headlines.
From Jay Leno.
Yeah. And you know, we can live with nature. This is a picture taken from my bedroom window. And things are actually not that bad around here. A lot better than they used to be. Yep, that was the mill in Westtown. Exactly right. So things are much better than they used to be. There's a brick factory on West Beach. I'm not sure if it's spelled West Beach, right? There used to be a brick factory there. Kimball Brick Factory, I guess. Quarrying, Fish Bay. Boy, that's a beautiful forest, isn't it? Come on. So we actually use these, as friends of mine say who have been in the logging business, these islands have been scraped twice, at least twice. And many of the areas that people think are pristine, I'll hear somebody, you know, a friend of mine will hear somebody wax poetically about some pristine area of the islands, and he'll say, yeah, my dad and I, we logged that in 1960. You know, it's because nature does recover, it does work. We are using these islands a lot less hard than we used to. That's Richardson back in 19.